Bob Dylan set up his guitar, looked at the crowd, and saw the empty seat in the third row. Then he changed the song he'd planned to play that night. He never explained why. November 1975. The Beacon Theater, New York City. The Rolling Thunder Revue Tour. 2,000 people packed into the ornate venue, the kind of place where velvet seats still had brass number plates, and the ceiling carried ghosts of 100 years of performances. Dylan stood backstage, tuning his guitar in that methodical way he had, not looking at the instrument, just listening, adjusting, listening again. Around him, the controlled chaos of a tour in motion, musicians warming up, crew checking cables, the low hum of anticipation that builds before any show. He'd been on the road for weeks. The setlist had become routine, comfortable in the way that repetition makes things comfortable. Tonight would be no different. The same songs in the same order. The same rhythms the audience had come to expect. But Dylan never liked comfort. And the universe had a way of disrupting his routines. 5 minutes, the stage manager called out. Dylan nodded without looking up. He slipped his harmonica holder over his head, the familiar weight settling against his chest. His fingers found the guitar strings one more time, playing a few quiet notes that no one else could hear over the backstage noise. He walked to the stage entrance. Stood in the darkness just beyond the curtain. Waiting. The house lights dimmed. The crowd noise shifted from conversation to anticipation. 2,000 people settling into their seats, programs rustling, final coughs and whispers fading into expectant silence. Dylan stepped onto the stage. The spotlight hit him. Not harsh. This wasn't that kind of show. Just warm light finding him in the darkness, picking him out like a memory surfacing. He didn't say anything. He never did at the start. Just stood there, guitar hanging from its strap, looking out at the faces he couldn't quite see past the lights. His eyes adjusted slowly. The first few rows became visible. Faces. Expressions. People who'd paid money to be here, to hear him, to witness whatever it was he chose to give them tonight. And then he saw it. Third row. 7 seats from the left. Empty. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. It wasn't just empty. It was the only empty seat in the first 10 rows. Maybe the only empty seat in the entire theater. A red velvet vacancy catching the ambient light, surrounded by occupied chairs, by people leaning forward in anticipation. Dylan's fingers stopped moving on the guitar strings. His hand fell to his side. For maybe 3 seconds, an eternity in the silence of a waiting crowd, he just stared at that empty seat. Someone in the audience coughed. The sound seemed too loud. Dylan's bandmates stood ready behind him. Scarlett Rivera with her violin. Rob Stoner on bass. All waiting for him to begin, to play the opening number everyone knew was coming. But Dylan didn't begin. He kept looking at that empty chair. Row 3, seat 7. The brass plate on the back caught a sliver of light, 3G. Something shifted in his expression. Not visible from the back rows, maybe not even visible from the front rows. But anyone who'd watched Dylan perform for years could sense it. The way his shoulders settled differently, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked down at his setlist taped to the floor near his microphone. The opening song was written there in his own handwriting, underlined twice because he'd been planning to hit it hard tonight, to start with energy. He didn't play it. Instead, he pulled the harmonica from its holder, brought it to his lips, and played 4 slow, mournful notes that no one in that theater had expected to hear. The band behind him froze. This wasn't the arrangement. This wasn't the song. But they knew better than to question Bob Dylan when he changed his mind mid-moment. They followed. The melody that filled the Beacon Theater that November night was One Too Many Mornings. A song Dylan hadn't performed in over 2 years, a song that wasn't on the set list, a song about leaving and distance, and the weight of doors you can't walk back through. To understand why Dylan changed the song, you need to understand what happened 6 days earlier. November 14, 1975. A diner in Boston. 3 in the morning after a show at the music hall. Dylan sat alone in a corner booth, coffee going cold in front of him, notebook open but nothing written in it. He often ended up in places like this after concerts. Anonymous diners where the waitress didn't recognize him or pretended not to, where he could sit and decompress in fluorescent silence while the rest of the world slept. The bell above the door chimed. A man walked in. Maybe 60 years old, wearing a worn jacket, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd been walking for hours. He sat down 3 booths away from Dylan. Ordered coffee. Stared at it the same way Dylan was staring at his. Dylan noticed him the way you notice anyone else awake at 3 in the morning, with a kind of tired solidarity. The man pulled something from his jacket pocket. A small photograph, edges soft with age. He set it on the table in front of him, next to the coffee cup, and just looked at it. Dylan couldn't see what the photograph showed. Didn't need to. The way the man was looking at it said everything. After maybe 10 minutes of silence, the man spoke. Not to Dylan. Just out loud, to himself or to the photograph or to the empty diner. She loved your music, he said quietly. Played it all the time. Said you understood things other people didn't bother to understand. Dylan's pen stopped moving across the empty page of his notebook. The man didn't look up from the photograph. We were supposed to see you next week. New York show. Got the tickets 6 months ago. She was so excited. He paused. Took a breath that sounded like it hurt. She died 4 days ago. Cancer. She made me promise I'd still go. Said I should take someone else, not waste the ticket. Dylan's coffee had gone completely cold. He didn't move. I can't do it. The man continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't sit in that theater with someone else in her seat. Can't listen to the songs she loved while she's... He stopped. Picked up the photograph. Put it back in his pocket. The seat's going to be empty. Row 3, seat G. I just thought you should know someone was supposed to be there. The man stood up, left money on the table for coffee he hadn't drunk, and walked out into the November cold. Dylan sat in that booth for another hour. Didn't write anything in his notebook. Didn't touch his coffee. Just sat there with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the knowledge that somewhere in New York, in the Beacon Theater, row 3 seat G would be empty. Subscribe and leave a comment. Because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. Dylan never tried to find the man. Never asked his name. That wasn't how these moments worked. But 6 days later, standing on the Beacon Theater stage, looking at that empty red velvet seat in row 3, Dylan remembered. And he changed the song. He played One Too Many Mornings. The way he'd written it 15 years earlier, spare, slow, each word given weight and space. The audience didn't understand why he'd chosen this particular song to open with. It wasn't energetic. It wasn't what they'd expected. But halfway through the second verse, Dylan's eyes found that empty seat again. And he kept them there. It's a restless, hungry feeling. That don't mean no one no good. When everything I may sayin', you can say it just as good. The words filled the theater. Filled the empty seat. Filled the space where someone should have been sitting. Dylan didn't explain. When the song ended, he moved immediately into the next one, and the next, working through his set with that same focused intensity he always brought to performance. But 3 songs later he stopped again. The band continued for a measure, then fell silent when they realized Dylan wasn't with them. He stood at the microphone, looking out at the crowd. His hand went to the harmonica holder, but he didn't pull the harmonica free. He just stood there, one hand on his guitar, the other resting on the metal holder. This one's for people who can't be here, he said quietly. His voice barely carried past the first few rows, but the theater was so silent that everyone heard it. For people who were supposed to be in these seats. Who wanted to be here. Who should be here. He didn't say anything else. Just nodded to the band and began playing Sarah, another song that wasn't on the set list, another departure from the plan. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. After the show, Dylan didn't go back to the hotel with the band. He stood backstage while the crew broke down equipment, while the theater slowly emptied, while the house lights came up and revealed all the small imperfections that stage lights hide. He walked back out onto the empty stage. Looked at the seats. Row 3 was clearly visible now, all the red velvet chairs in neat rows, brass number plates gleaming. Seat G looked exactly like all the others. Dylan stood there for a long time, just looking. The theater manager eventually appeared, politely asking if everything was all right, if Mr. Dylan needed anything. "That seat," Dylan said, pointing to row 3, seat G. "Someone was supposed to be sitting there tonight." The manager looked confused. "It was sold, Mr. Dylan. Along with the rest of the house." "I know. But they couldn't come. They died." The manager didn't know what to say to that. Dylan reached into his jacket and pulled out a harmonica, not the one he'd used during the show, but an older one, worn smooth by years of use. He walked down the stage steps, into the audience area, down the aisle to row 3. He set the harmonica on seat G. "Keep that there," he told the manager. "Don't throw it away. Someone earned it." Then he walked out of the Beacon Theater into the November cold. The manager stood in the empty theater, looking at the harmonica resting on the red velvet seat. He didn't touch it. He didn't move it. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. Dylan never mentioned the empty seat to anyone on his tour. Never talked about the man in the Boston diner. Never explained why he changed the setlist that night. But something had shifted. In the shows that followed, he began adding pauses between songs. Not long ones, just moments of silence where he'd look out at the audience and seem to be seeing individual faces instead of a collective crowd. He started playing songs that weren't on the setlist. Songs requested by people in the front rows. Songs that seemed to come to him in the moment, responding to something invisible in the room. The Rolling Thunder Revue became less of a planned performance and more of a conversation. Dylan listening to the silence, to the empty spaces, to the people who weren't there as much as to the people who were. Years later, a music journalist asked Dylan about that tour, about how it differed from his others. Dylan was characteristically evasive, giving answers that weren't really answers. But at the end of the interview, he said something that stuck with the journalist. "Every seat tells a story. The empty ones most of all. They remind you that music isn't just for the people in the room. It's for the people who wanted to be in the room. Who should have been? Who would have been if the world had been kinder?" The Beacon Theater manager kept the harmonica on seat G for 3 weeks after the concert. Then one day, a man in his 60s appeared at the box office. Asked if he could sit in row 3, seat G, just for a moment. Said his wife had tickets for the Dylan show but hadn't been able to attend. The manager took him to the seat. The harmonica was still there. The man sat down. Saw the harmonica. Picked it up with trembling hands. He didn't ask how it got there. He just held it, sitting in the seat his wife should have occupied, crying quietly while theater staff pretended not to notice. When he left, he thanked the manager. Said it meant more than anyone would ever know. The manager never told him it was Dylan who'd left it. Some gifts aren't meant to be explained. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Bob Dylan never saw the empty seat filled. Never knew if the man found the harmonica. Never asked? But in every city after that, before each show, Dylan would stand in the wings and look out at the seats filling up. Looking for the empty ones. Seeing who wasn't there. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, he'd change the set list. Play something unplanned. Something for the ghosts in the room. Years later, someone asked Dylan why he still performed after all these decades. Why he kept touring when he didn't need the money or the fame. He didn't answer directly. Just said, "There's always an empty seat somewhere. Someone who should have been there. The music's for them too." The harmonica never made it to a museum. The man kept it. Played it sometimes, badly in his living room. It didn't matter that he couldn't play well. It mattered that Dylan had seen the empty seat and remembered. That's what legends do. They notice the silence. And they fill it without being asked.